Good. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. We have a special seminar today. Danielle Santiago Ramos is visiting us from Princeton, and she's being considered for a faculty position here in the department. And we were lucky enough to be able to get her to come up on short notice, and she's going to give us a talk. And then we have meetings set up for the afternoon for a lot of people. If you haven't signed up for a meeting and would like to talk, reach out to me after the seminar, and we can get everyone organized. We're going to record the seminar because some people are teaching and won't be able to attend live, but they can go back and look at it remotely. Danielle got her PhD at Princeton with John Higgins, looking at elemental cycling, and then joined Hui as a postdoc looking at deep cycling of elements and subduction processes, and has now rejoined Princeton as a lecturer. So she has got a heavy teaching load this fall, and we are lucky to have her close by so we can actually have her visit us face to face. So I'm not going to steal any of her thunder, and I just want to hand off to Danielle.
All right, thank you. Oh, I can hear myself. Am I good now? Yes, perfect. So everyone can hear me? All right, I will start sharing my screen so we can get going. Great. Thank you so much, Oscar, for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's my first talk in person in a long while. And I'm excited to share some of my research with you, and hopefully there'll be a little bit of everything to get folks interested and get conversations going. And as promised, I will talk about potassium cycling in seawater today. But before going to that, I actually wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of what kind of projects I have been working on, and go from there. So I'm interested in lots of different processes. They're all ultimately related to what sets the chemistry of seawater through time. So this is a plot that quite old now, but it shows concentrations on the y-axis here in geologic time. And it has always interested me how some ions in seawater have changed so much while others have been constant or near constant through time, which is the case of potassium. Whether that result will hold is still a matter of debate, but just understanding these cycles in seawater is something that I'm very interested in. So this will actually be the topic of the talk today. But then there are also specific processes affecting the chemistry of seawater that I have been focusing on. One of them is the so-called reverse weathering and its effect on the global carbon cycle. So there'll be a little bit of that during the talk today too. And for those who are not super familiar with reverse weathering, I have a very simple equation here. It's just the formation of silicates that are associated with the consumption of carbonates, so consumption of alkalinity from the ocean, and how that affects the global carbon cycle is something that I'm very interested in. Another broad topic of my research is hydrothermal alteration of oceanic crust, both at high temperature and low temperature. So I use different isotope systems to investigate this process that is very important for setting seawater chemistry, but also setting the composition of what goes down subduction zones during this deep cycling, right? So the fourth topic here would be, once we understand these seawater or the surface processes and how they define the composition of the rock that goes down subduction zone, what happens? And how does this cycling affect the composition of continental crust through time? So these are the broad topics that I will revisit when I discuss future research interests. But as promised for today, we will focus on seawater itself. But I would say that if I were to pinpoint one thing that kind of combines all these different interests would be my interest in the global silicate cycle, and especially how it relates to the cycle of carbon in our planet, both the superficial and the deep cycle. And although today I'll be focusing on potassium isotopes, as it turns out, I use a variety of different isotope systems to investigate these processes. So pretty excited to discuss these with folks who are doing similar work and interested in similar processes as well. So like I said, for today, and as promised, I will talk about the potassium cycling in seawater. And potassium cycling in seawater is not a new topic. People have been interested in potassium in seawater for a long time. But what we bring of new to the table is the use of stable potassium isotopes. This is a new geochemical proxy, and lots of exciting things have been done with potassium isotopes in the last few years. So for today, I'll just give you an overview of what we learn about the potassium cycle from the use of potassium isotopes. And each one of these figures will make sense to you as we go along the way. I am hoping that this presentation kind of give you my teaching style as well. I deal with heterogeneous groups when I'm teaching at Princeton especially, and just trying to get everyone on the same page, enough background for people to understand and students to understand what I'm talking about is something that I am very interested in and kind of conscientious about. So hopefully it will be showcased here throughout this talk. But I always like to start by why I'm interested in potassium and why I spent so much of my PhD kind of developing this new proxy and trying to understand the processes affecting potassium in seawater. And I start with the fact that potassium is a main ion in animal and plant cells. So on the left-hand side here, you have a simple diagram of a cell membrane, and basically the health of the cell and its osmotic regulation is something that potassium is directly associated with. This will come up again towards the end as I discuss future research. But because of this, it's the reason why we fix our crops with potassium-rich fertilizers, right? It's a major, very important cation in animal and plant cells. Also, potassium is a major component in continental crust. So it is a good proxy for understanding continental crust formation processes, and is specifically associated with the process of subduction. So I, at Hui, and hopefully in future projects, have used potassium to trace deep cycling of elements as well. As a mobile element in fluids, potassium is a good proxy to understand how water, for example, is being carried into the mantle and transferred back to the surface of our planet. So on the right-hand side here is just some data on minerals that have been found in subduction-related rocks. And you can see here the upper panel, halite and sylvite, that's a potassium-rich mineral. So potassium gets carried into the mantle and sometimes survives metamorphism and goes into the deep mantle as well. So understanding the chemistry of the mantle and how that communicates with the surface of the planet is something that potassium might be very helpful for. But as I said, for this talk specifically, we'll focus on potassium as it stands as a major component of seawater. So understanding what sets the chemistry of potassium through time, and hopefully by learning something about potassium, we can then extrapolate and understand how the same processes are affecting other biogeochemical cycles as well. So for today's talk, the main research question that we're trying to understand here is what controls the seawater potassium budget? And like I said, this is not a new question, and folks have been trying to understand this for a long time, but the methodology here that we use is stable potassium isotope measurements. And this is actually kind of a novel isotope system. So definitely a novel way to approach an old question. And for those who are not constantly working with isotopes, maybe I figured I would put a quick primer here, because even if you have been working with isotopes, potassium might not be on your mind quite a lot. So potassium has two stable isotopes, 41 and 39. Isotopes just being different flavors of the same element they have different masses. So because of that difference in mass, they behave differently during chemical reactions. So what that means is we might be able to track chemical reactions on the surface of the Earth and in the deep Earth by tracking these two isotopes. So I'll be talking a lot about potassium isotopic composition and isotopic composition in general. And just so you know, what I mean by that is the delta notation here. It's basically the ratio of the two isotopes in my sample of interest relative to an agreed upon standard. And these differences are typically really small. So we multiply by 1,000 so that we're dealing with numbers that make a little more sense. And just a note here, if you do read potassium isotope literature out there, the standard here is seawater itself, because I'm interested in understanding seawater chemistry. However, depending on the publication, the standard might be different. But that's just, so if you find differences here in how I report my data versus what you're used to, that's the reason why. So potassium isotopes are novel because they're actually really hard measurement to make. And there is a lot of information here on what we do to make these measurements possible. And I don't want to go too much into that. For those who are interested, we can discuss later if you'd like. But just a very quick overview here of how I got most of the data that I'll be discussing today. Potassium isotope measurements involve two main steps. The first one is a chemical purification. So I have to purify potassium out of the samples of interest here. And at Princeton, I was really lucky to use an automated system. So the throughput was pretty high. You can see here on the bottom left, the conductivity versus time. It's basically in real time, you can track the quality of your potassium purification, and you can set the instrument to collect your element of interest. So it was really cool. But the ratios themselves were measured in a mass spectrometer, a Thermo Fisher Scientific Neptune MCS BMS. And I have a plot here of the different masses that I'm tracking. There are details of how to make this measurement and kind of get around the really high mass interferences in this instrument. And if you're curious about that, I'll be more than happy to discuss. But for today, again, I want to share a potassium isotope data with regards to the seawater potassium cycle. And before I go into the actual data, just want to give you a very quick overview of what we understand about the potassium cycle on Earth. So potassium has two main sources to the oceans, and the first one and major being continental silicate weathering. So potassium that is carried by rivers into the ocean. Another important process is the high temperature alteration of oceanic crust. So think mid-ocean ridge axis. They're leaching potassium into the ocean as well. And in terms of sinks, potassium gets taken out of the ocean through the formation of secondary silicates in marine environments. So you can think of secondary silicates forming during sedimentary diagenesis in shallow marine environments or deep sea environments. And also during alteration of oceanic crust once again. So potassium is an interesting element in that depending on the temperature of alteration of the oceanic crust, you might either be leaching potassium or incorporating potassium into the altered crust. And that threshold, by the way, is not something that we understand very well. So this might actually be an interesting project to pursue in the future. But for those who are working with biogeochemical cycles, I'm sure you recognize all of these processes as being important for other elements as well. So the idea here is that, yes, I'm focusing on potassium, but hopefully any constraints that I can get from these different sources and sinks might help me understand other geochemical cycles as well. And I'm interested in other cycles like lithium, magnesium in the oceans as well. So another way to think of this potassium cycle in seawater is to just collapse this picture that I just painted into a box model, right? Where you have fluxes going in here in green and fluxes coming out. And as I said, lots of research done on potassium cycling. I'm here citing something from decades ago, like over 40 years ago. So there is information, and we know that continental silicate weathering is the main source of potassium to the oceans. But as you can see here, the fluxes have pretty high uncertainty. So we don't really know, for example, which one of the two sinks of potassium is the most important one. We don't know that about the modern, we don't know that about the past either. And these fluxes are here given in 10 to the 12 grams, so teragrams of potassium per year, which I didn't really have an understanding the first time I see these numbers. So just to give you an idea of what a teragram would look like, the US applies roughly 1 to 2 teragrams of potassium to its crops per year. So it would be something on the order of the lower end of, say, the hydrothermal fluxes of potassium. So these are very large fluxes. But as I mentioned, although we do know something about these fluxes, the uncertainties are huge. So the idea is, can we use potassium isotopes to kind of improve this picture about what is controlling seawater potassium over time? So that's what the talk today is basically trying to address. And I always like to start with this plot here. It doesn't have every single data produced yet. I should update, but it's giving you an overview of what kind of variability we see in the delta 41K composition of all sorts of different materials. And this is all measurements that I did over my time at Princeton. And it shows here that potassium isotopic composition of materials shows a pretty large range, over 2 per mil, 3 per mil. And the arrow bars that I'm dealing with are something like 0.2 per mil. So there's definitely enough variability to justify using potassium as a proxy for different processes. But for the purpose of this talk, what I want to call your attention to on this plot here is the difference between two important potassium reservoirs, which are bulk silica earth here in like a dark brown, and seawater. And specifically, seawater is roughly 0.5 per mil more enriched than bulk silica earth. So the idea is that maybe we can focus on this difference and try to understand how potassium isotopes get cycled, and then hopefully learn about the processes that are setting this change or this difference to begin with. So that's what we do. But before I talk about the data and how we interpret the data, I just want to give you a quick overview of what I mean by isotope fractionation, because that's going to come up a lot throughout the talk. So on the left-hand side here, just I'm showing you a reservoir, a random reservoir called A, that has some ratio of potassium 41 to potassium 39. Now imagine that there's some chemical reaction that happens, and maybe some chemical sediments are produced, or here the reservoir just gets split into 2 reservoirs. But that chemical reaction, as it turns out in this illustration, it preferentially takes up the light isotope of potassium, right? So you can see here, the brown reservoir has more 39K than 41. So we say that there was an isotope fractionation here between the 2 reservoirs. And we can then say that the reservoir A is isotopically heavy relative to reservoir B. So it's that difference that I've been mentioning in terms of seawater being heavier than bulk silica earth reservoir. So what I'm trying to track here is then what are the processes causing this isotope effects, okay? So again, the delta 41K can be cast as just a ratio of these 2 isotopes in this illustration. And the fractionation would just be the difference in isotopic composition between the 2 reservoirs. So I'm always comparing things to seawater in this talk. So every process will have seawater as kind of the standard for comparison here. And in this case, as hopefully you can see, my fractionation being that difference, this epsilon would be less than 0. So this would be what I would call a negative fractionation. So that should be helpful then for us to revisit this plot and imagine what are the processes that could be causing this difference in isotopic composition between seawater and bulk silica earth. And we propose 2 hypotheses. Maybe seawater is heavy because it's getting heavy material input into it, right? So maybe continental silicate weathering and hydrothermal alteration at high temperature is preferentially leaching that heavy potassium isotope. Or the other option is that the sinks of potassium in the ocean, they are light, leaving seawater enriched. So those are the 2 hypotheses that we'll test in this talk. And the idea here is that if we can incorporate some isotopic information about each one of these fluxes, then we have an additional layer that we can use of information to understand what sets the seawater chemistry, specifically for potassium here. So what I would do now is to test the two hypotheses that we put forth in trying to understand seawater chemistry. So maybe seawater is heavy because it's a source story, right? Are we getting isotopically heavy sources delivered to the ocean? So throughout the talk, we'll be visiting each one of these fluxes. And on the upper right side, I'll always have this little box here with the flux highlighted. So if you lose me for a second there, you can orient yourself. So there we go. The first important source of potassium to the oceans is continental silicate weathering, like I mentioned. We can learn about that by looking at the chemistry of rivers. So we do that here. We have potassium isotopic measurements in rivers across the globe, and this is thanks to collaborators. Some of these rivers are major rivers and some are more locally important. So what we do is, again, we measure the delta 41K, which is here on the x-axis of this figure for every one of these rivers. The major rivers are in black squares and the local minor rivers are the white squares. So first order observation here is that we see that the river composition of delta 41K spans values from bulk silica earth to seawater. And if you've done any measurements of chemistry in the river, you know that the potassium in river and other elements as well, it doesn't come only from the rocks being weathered, right? There is a little bit of sea salt contribution to that river. So a first thing to do here is to correct the chemistry of the river to that sea salt contribution so that we are only looking at continental silicate weathering. So when we do that, the corrected data are in this light gray. You see that the shift is not huge and you still see this really nice trend of rivers being either silicate-like or seawater-like. But if you get a global average of your river, so based on the amount of potassium each one is delivering to the ocean, you see that the global average is something like -0.4 to -0.3 per mil. So it is enriched relative to the rock being weathered. Maybe there's, not maybe, there's definitely products of weathering there that are taking up that light potassium and making the rivers slightly heavy. But what you can see here is that the rivers are definitely not heavy enough to explain the seawater isotopic enrichment, right? So what we conclude from this project is that the potassium delivered to the ocean is enriched relative to the rocks being weathered, but not enriched enough to explain the entire chemistry of the ocean. So we have to look elsewhere here. These data are not published. I got beat to it by other groups. So if you are interested in the chemistry of potassium in rivers, you can check two really nice publications that are now available. So you can have more information there. But then if we can't explain seawater chemistry by continental silicate weathering, we go elsewhere and we look at another source of potassium to the oceans. And I mentioned high temperature alteration of oceanic crust. So for this project, I looked at hydrothermal fluids from 3 different ridge systems, the Mid-Atlantic, the East Pacific Rise, and the Juan de Fuca Ridge. These are ridges with slightly different predominant lithology, and they have slightly different spreading rates as well. So we think it's a pretty good first order approximation for the global potassium source from hydrothermal alteration. So for each one of these fluids, and there were over 50 of them, I measured the potassium isotopic composition. But if you sample these fluids in your own research, you know that what you get is actually a mix between the true hydrothermal fluid and seawater that gets entrained during mixing. So for every one of these vent locations, I had to correct for that seawater entrainment and get at the true hydrothermal fluid composition. So that true hydrothermal fluid composition is what I plot here. Again, x-axis is delta 41K. I have modern seawater in blue for your reference and bulk silica earth, which in this case would be depicting the composition of the rock that is being leached during alteration, okay? So what you can see here is that the delta 41K of these fluids across the board, they're within error pretty much of the isotopic composition of the rock being weathered. If you look at the potassium content of each one of these and get at a global average, you see that the delta 41K of hydrothermal fluids is roughly minus 0.5 per mil, which is very similar to the bulk silica earth number. So in this case, what we find is that potassium delivered to the oceans through high temperature alteration of oceanic crust is indistinguishable from bulk silica earth. So it cannot explain that offset between seawater and bulk silica earth itself. So what we find here is that so far we can't really understand the isotopic composition of seawater from a source perspective. We must look at the sinks. And the answer obviously has to be there, right? Because it's either source and or sinks. And we find that answer in some really cool ways. So the first sink of potassium that we consider in this research is sedimentary diagenesis, where secondary silicates are forming as these marine sediments get altered. So we look to try to understand this process by looking at pore fluids themselves initially. And this is because the secondary silicates, they are authigenic in situ processes. And it turns out that the amount of authegenesis turns out to be small relative to just the detrital material in your ocean sediment, right? So trying to isolate that signal from the sediment itself is a really difficult task. But if you focus on the pore fluid, you might actually get some really important information about this chemical exchanges happening in the sedimentary environment. So on the left-hand side here, I have a very simple diagram. Seawater, sediment, and crust, and we're actually going to walk from sediment into crust as we're trying to understand potassium chemistry. So we start with pore fluids. Like I said, these were samples sourced by ODP and IODP cruises, and they come from 4 different sites here, shown in this map. The sites have different characteristics, different sedimentation rates that I will mention in a little bit. But again, just to stress, what I'm interested in tracking here is if pore fluid chemistry can tell me anything about these reactions going on, where authigenic silicates are forming from the exchange between pore fluid and the detrital material. So this authigenic phase is what I'm after. The first order observation is to say, well, is there evidence that potassium is being taken up in these pore fluids, right? So here I have panels where x-axis, I have potassium concentration in each pore fluid, and the depth is on the y-axis. Have some information on sediment composition, but I can tell you that it doesn't vary that much across the different sites. And what you can see here is that, yes, there's a lot of local geometry, kind of interesting things happening here in potassium concentration, but overall, I think it's fair to say that potassium concentration decreases as you go from the sediment water interface at 0 meters into the sediment. So these are all good candidates to investigate what happens in terms of isotope fractionation during authigenic silica formation. But if you work with pore fluids before, you know that reaction is not the only thing controlling pore fluid chemistry. There are other processes as well. One very important process in this case is diffusion of potassium from seawater into the sediment pore fluid. This is important because there has been there is a lot of literature that shows potassium isotopes fractionate during aqueous diffusion. So the lighter one diffuses faster than the heavier one. So it is bound to affect the isotope chemistry of pore fluid potassium. Another important process is advection, just you know, as more sediment gets deposited in your sediment column, it will squeeze the sediment underneath. Some potassium gets released as that advected water leaves the system. So this is an important process if you're interested in potassium concentrations, but with respect to isotopes, it shouldn't affect isotopic composition. But these are 4 different sites with very different sediment accumulation rates, which should be important for advection and also diffusion processes. So we separate this 4 sites into the fast accumulating ones and the slow accumulating ones. And when we measure the potassium isotopic composition of these fluids, it's really interesting because it seems like this the potassium isotopic profiles, they broadly correlate with sedimentation rate. So each panel here is, again, one for each site. The x-axis is now delta 41K composition. So what we find in this study is that for the slow accumulating sites, potassium seems to decrease monotonically with depth. So you have seawater, this dashed red line there, as 0 per mil. And as you go into the sediment, your pore fluid is becoming lighter and lighter and lighter. At the fast accumulating sites, what you find is that although there is a little bit of variability there, pore fluid in general looks like seawater itself. So this is kind of an intricate process because, or an intricate problem because there are lots of processes affecting potassium chemistry in these fluids. So what we do to kind of try and extract some information about these processes is we do a 1D diffusion advection reaction modeling of this system. And what I'm doing basically is at any time step, I'm tracking the concentration of both isotopes of potassium as a function of all these processes that I just mentioned. I'm tracking aqueous diffusion and how it fractionates potassium. I'm tracking advection, which does not fractionate potassium. And the main thing here that I'm after is are these potassium consuming reactions, right? And what do they do to the potassium budget? So for us to extract any isotope information, first, you need to match the potassium profile at each pore fluid. So this is a test that your model is working. And I dare to say that we do a good job here of kind of reproducing this potassium profile for each one of these sites, even the ones with some complicated local changes there. But what I'm after really is, can I match then the isotopic profile with all the same parameters that I'm using here to track concentration changes? And there is a lot of information in this GCA paper if you're interested in pore fluid chemistry. But for this talk, the bottom line is, yes, we can explain each one of these potassium isotopic profiles. And we do so by invoking fractionation factors anywhere between 0 and -2. And what that means is when there is fractionation during potassium cycling in these systems, it seems like the light potassium tends to be preferentially taken up during diagenesis. So this is important because if the light one is leaving the system, seawater is becoming heavier, right? So we're trying to understand that enrichment. Now, again, looking at sediments is really difficult because altogenic potassium-rich phases are hard to separate from the bulk sediment, which is usually detrital. But there are some places in the ocean that you can actually go that have low detrital input, and maybe you can get some altogenic signal there. So for this project, we do that. We'll look at the sediment itself. That place is the South Pacific Gyre, where detrital input is really small. Sedimentation rates are slow, so maybe we can get a little bit of the altogenic signal in the sediment itself. So that's the goal. And just to highlight here, sedimentation rates are really, really small compared to the other pore fluid sites that I've looked at. And what we see here is clear evidence for potassium incorporation into the secondary phases. So on the left-hand side here, you have potassium to rubidium concentration of the sediments. And on the y-axis, you have delta 41K of the sediments. So the shaded rectangle here is just showing you what bulk silica earth or the detrital component would look like. And you see a lot of this material looks like just detrital potassium. But what you see is that there is evidence for incorporation of potassium in some of these sediments. And that incorporation is followed by changes in delta 41K composition. So this is really reassuring. Maybe we can see something here in terms of potassium cycling. Another way to look into this is to plot potassium isotope composition as a function of that detrital component in your sediment. So again, on the x-axis here, if you are at 100% post-Archean average shale, which is just a proxy for detrital composition, you would look like bulk silica earth. But you see a potassium enrichment as you go into lower and lower and lower detrital components in the sediments. At roughly 0% detrital, which would mean that those sediments are really authigenic rich, you see a variability there in terms of delta 41K. And you can do a quick mass balance and try to derive what your authigenic phase would look like and compare it to seawater, which ultimately is sourcing potassium to these phases. And when you do that, you find that fractionation during sedimentary diagenesis is anywhere between 0 and minus 0.5 per mil. So a tighter range relative to the pore fluid study, but the same order of business here. Light potassium isotope seems to be preferentially taken up in the secondary silicates forming during marine sedimentary diagenesis. So again, internally consistent and pretty exciting result. Now, another important thing is to look at low temperature oceanic crust alteration, which is also an important sink of potassium in a modern through time. And so we're going down our sediment or seafloor here, looking at oceanic crust itself. And if you're not familiar with oceanic crust profile, I have a very simplified diagram here. You go from upper volcanics, there are pillow basalts and sheet flows, high porosity, lots of exchange with seawater. As you go deeper into the crust, you start getting sheeted dikes and then more ultramafic stuff that is kind of compositionally similar to the lithospheric mantle. So for low temperature alteration, you do want to focus on the upper volcanics. And a picture here of the pillow basalts that I sampled at the trudosophiolite in Cyprus, that's where the action happens in terms of potassium incorporation during alteration. So we focus here. That picture was from Trudeau's, so I actually went there and sampled oceanic crust myself, but I also have data on the isotopic composition of an in situ crust, which is from ODP hole 801C. So the trudosophiolite is roughly 90 million years old, so Cretaceous in age. ODP hole 801C is Jurassic in age, roughly 167 million years old. For panel B here, it will come up later, but I was able to sample across the sediment upper volcanics section of the trudosophiolite. So we did a really interesting detailed study of alteration in the zophiolite. But for the purpose of this talk, what I want to understand is potassium being incorporated? And if so, is there any isotope effect associated with it? And if so, is that helping set seawater to become heavier? So this panel here should show you evidence for exchange between oceanic crusted seawater in both of these sites. So on the x-axis is potassium to titanium, and on the y-axis is radiogenic strontium ratios. If you're not familiar with radiogenic strontium and what that tells you, basically seawater is way more enriched in 87 strontium than a mafic oceanic crust would be. So as you can see here on the lower left, these little rectangle, the gray one is from the Trudeau's fresh rock, and the little black one is what 801C fresh rock would look like. So you can see it's low in both radiogenic strontium and potassium content. But all these different sampled altered rocks that we got from both sites show way more potassium and way more radiogenic ratios, right? So this is clear evidence that there is exchange with seawater and that seawater is sourcing potassium into the rock as it gets altered. So again, really good place to look at the effect of alteration in the potassium cycle. So what we get from this study, or one of the things that we get from this study, is a sense for the delta 41K composition of that altered material. So on the x-axis here is delta 41K, and this is just a distribution of compositions in both Trudeau's, which are the white bars, and hole 801C, which are the gray bars. First order observation is that there is a lot of variability. This shouldn't be surprising for those working on oceanic crust alteration. It's a very heterogeneous process. This variability is telling me that potassium might actually be a nice proxy for that type of process. But the main thing here to get is that the average altered oceanic crust is similar between the two sites, and it's roughly minus 0.5 per mil. So again, if seawater sourcing that zero per mil potassium and the rock ends up at negative 0.5, what is happening is, once again, light potassium gets incorporated into seawater. So again, internally consistent. And if we revisit this plot of the difference in composition between seawater and bulk silicate earth, I think we can now together come to this conclusion that what sets potassium in seawater to be isotopically enriched relative to bulk silicate earth is this preferential uptake of the light potassium in secondary silicates. And these are forming during marine silicate diagenesis, or sedimentary diagenesis, sorry, during alteration of oceanic crust, but also it's the reason why rivers are slightly heavier relative to the rocks being weathered, because clays, secondary clays, are an important process of continental silicate weathering. So this is really exciting because then we can revisit the potassium cycle and input an additional information about the different fluxes, and that information will be isotopic composition, right? So if you worked on biogeochemical cycles, it's really typical to write the change in concentration of our element of interest as a function of the fluxes in and out of the ocean. And what you can do then is, if you assume that there is no change, that your system is at steady state, you can say that the fluxes in equal fluxes out. So you have this very simple equation to figure out fluxes of your element of interest. So that's done all the time. But now what we introduce here is a second layer of information, which is with regards to the delta 41K composition of each one of these fluxes, right? So you can write the same mass balance equation, but in addition to the flux information, you can input isotopic information here. If you do a little bit of algebra, make the same assumption of steady state, you can write the isotopic composition of seawater as a function of fluxes and isotopic information, okay? So this is just simple algebra with some substitutions there. But the cool thing here then is you now have two equations that you can solve for to try to get information on the potassium cycle. And we do that. We do that by using a Monte Carlo approach. And this is a good approach because, as you've seen here, we have ranges of values, both for fluxes and for isotopic compositions and for fractionation factors, right? At any given time, the information I'm getting from these studies is a range. So it's important for us to consider the entire range when we try to solve these two equations and get information on the potassium cycle. So what I do here is I start with probability distributions for every flux and every delta value and every fractionation value. Some of them I know very well to be normal distributions. So for example, the delta 41K of hydrothermally altered oceanic crust. But some of them I don't know much about. So I just prescribe a uniform distribution. Say the flux of rivers has a range, anywhere within that range, it's possible for that number to be a correct number for that flux. So what we do then is we sample multiple times every one of these distributions, and we use those sampled values to solve the two equations. So at any given time, you're solving two equations simultaneously. If your values solve both equations, they're good. If they don't solve either or one of them, it's bad. So you toss those values, okay? So what you can do is you can update these distributions, and then hopefully the updated distributions will give you a better picture of the cycle itself. So there's a lot of information that comes out of this type of modeling, and I'm happy to discuss how each distribution varies with you. But for this talk, what I wanted to highlight are two main results. The first result comes from these two plots. So on the x-axis here is fractionation during alteration of oceanic crust and sedimentary diagenesis, so the two sinks of potassium from seawater. The blue bars are the distributions as they were initially, and then the orange ones are the updated distributions after I try to solve those two equations, okay? So what you can see here is that the fractionation associated with altered oceanic crust seems to be different than the fractionation associated with diagenesis. And again, it's silicates forming at both scenarios, right? So this is really exciting because it might be telling me that this might be a cool proxy to understand silicate formation in different environments. It's not just silicate forming. It might actually help us to understand what kind of processes are controlling that secondary silicate formation. And then another interesting result is I kind of alluded to the fact that we don't really know which one of the two sinks of potassium is the most important for the modern cycle. And we definitely don't know much about cycle in the past, right? So this probability distribution here that we get for the percent of the total sink of potassium that relates to diagenesis itself, you can see that the mean of this distribution is roughly 52%. So the other 48% would be altered oceanic crust, right? So what this result is telling me is that the two sinks are actually relatively important, similar importance to the modern potassium cycle. And how that relative importance might have changed through time is something that I'm really interested in figuring out. So this brings me to the conclusion of this presentation before I move on to what I'm interested in for future research. So first order observation here is that this variability in potassium isotopic composition tells us that potassium isotopes might be used for proxies for all sorts of different environments and questions that you might be interested in. There's a lot of data here from different processes. Also, this enrichment in seawater can be understood as a result of potassium isotope effects during the formation of secondary silicates. And these are forming during continental silicate weathering, during sedimentary diagenesis, and during alteration of oceanic crust. So if you're interested in any of these processes, this might be a useful proxy for you. Also, this conclusion that isotope effects may vary depending on which environment you are in the ocean. If you're in a deltaic environment, making secondary silicates, you might be fractionating potassium differently than if you're in oceanic crust being altered. So again, really cool, because then this might be useful for us to understand the mechanics and thermodynamics and kinetics of these processes. So this is definitely something that I'm interested in for future research. And then also we find that the two sinks of seawater potassium appear to be of similar magnitude. This is really key because some people have said, for example, that 15% of all seawater potassium gets taken up in sedimentary diagenesis only in the Amazon Delta. So that is a huge fraction of the potassium into that one sink. So this is kind of a result that might be in conflict with that. And if it holds, this would give us some really important understanding about shallow marine environments and their importance for biogeochemical cycles. And then finally, this range in isotopic composition of altered oceanic crust is also very exciting because as that material gets subducted, it might introduce heterogeneities into the mantle. So this is really cool because understanding the chemistry of the mantle is important for understanding things like composition of the crust, right, through time. This is work that I am actively doing with Dr. Suna Nielsen at Hui. So in addition to all these things and results that I kind of want to pursue further, I just wanted to revisit those 4 panels from the very beginning of my talk to kind of give you a sense for what are the things I'm interested in pursuing in future research. So again, this plot of seawater chemistry through time shows a lot of variability in concentrations of things like magnesium, calcium sulfate, but then there's potassium that seems to be have remained constant through time. And that's weird because the processes affecting all these other elements are processes that are also affecting potassium. So what is it about the potassium cycle that keeps it constant? But maybe it's a bias of the type of study itself. It's halite inclusions giving you seawater chemistry with important assumptions that have to be made for those results to be obtained. So the idea here is for us to challenge this result and has seawater really been near constant through time? And the idea is that maybe we can use evaporites in a different way. We can measure their isotopic composition, the isotopic composition of potassium-rich evaporites, and try to get at what seawater looks like at different places or times, actually. We have some preliminary data that show, for example, Permian evaporites having the same composition as modern. So that would go with a constant potassium through time. Also, I'm interested in how what we know about the potassium cycle might help us to know about other cycles in the ocean. And instead of just doing a global potassium cycle, I'm interested in doing global mass box models where I put different elements and I try to solve for all the elements using similar processes, right? So these would be pretty cool to understand things like lithium, magnesium, and obviously how all of these connect to the carbon cycle. With respect to alteration of oceanic crust, fascinated by this process. There is a lot to learn still. And I'm bringing this data from altered oceanic crust intrudos here on the right-hand side. I have distributions of potassium isotopic compositions, but also lithium of altered crust from different sites. And what I can tell you here is that this purple site, Onofrius, it was a site in a paleotopographic low that was sedimented very early on in its history. And you can see that the distribution in isotopic composition is very variable here. So the idea is that maybe we can use isotopes to trace mechanisms of oceanic crust alteration. And then if we can do that, can we then calibrate models of alteration of oceanic crust? And then using those models, can we then measure really old ophiolite and do both data and modeling to get at seawater chemistry in the deep past? So those are some of the things that I'm interested in as well. And I'm hopefully applying for this expedition 390 and 393, thanks to ERE who gave me the information. This expedition will sample like a time series of oceanic crust in the South Atlantic with different sedimentation histories and different age. So this would be an ideal sample set to try and understand alteration of oceanic crust in a better way. And then also, I don't know how I am with time. Wrap up. Yeah, great. I'm almost done. Just, reverse weathering is something that I'm interested in as well. And there's just a quick plot showing how Papua New Guinea and Southeast Asia in general is usually shown as hotspots for silicate weathering and have been connected to cooling over the Neogene. But these are also hotspots for reverse weathering reactions, which source CO2 to the atmosphere. So how those two would go together and control climate through time is something that I'm interested in, again, using isotopes. And then to wrap up, truly, we see some really interesting biological signals here as well. Fish that have very different delta 41K compositions. And the idea that maybe we can learn about fish migration and mechanisms of salt regulation in fish by using metaisotopes. So these are some of the things that I'm interested in. And these are just the names of all the folks who have worked with me and helped me throughout these past years. And thank you to them. And thank you to you as well for your time. I appreciate it. And I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Because we're in the same room and we'll have an echo, I'm going to let people just jump in and ask questions. So I open it up to the audience.
Hey, Oscar, I have a question. It's Vince. Hey, Danny, that was a great talk. I really enjoyed it, and really nice data set. I have a question that has like 2 or 3 parts to it, so I hope you'll bear with me. But
Yes.
so there's been some recent work showing that groundwater and submarine groundwater discharge can really affect the isotopic composition of different elemental and isotope systems like magnesium, calcium, lithium. And I'm wondering if there's a role for groundwater in the potassium isotopic budget of seawater. And if so, how might that influence the steady state assumption that you have at the end of your talk in getting the mass balance calculation, if we have this significant input of potassium into our agricultural systems, right? And assuming that permeates down to groundwater reservoirs, and then is discharged into the ocean at some future point? How might that affect the steady state going forward?
Wonderful. Fantastic question. Yes, the groundwater work, I was actually involved in the same work, and I was the one making potassium measurements for the same samples, and it didn't get incorporated into the paper because we don't see much there, which is really weird because salinity variability with seawater being so different than rivers and just freshwater in general. Why are we not seeing a signal? So then I bring the caveat here that, our error bars for potassium measurements are 0.2 per mil. These are improved from previous attempts at making potassium isotope measurements, but it's not necessarily a great signal or precision if you're trying to measure signals that are really, really small. So the idea here is that maybe we need to improve precision to be able to address some of these questions for which the signals might be really small. Okay, so that's the challenge right now. And the steady state assumption then is, it's a good point to bring up because it's an assumption that we need to make to do some calculations like the ones that I'm showing here, right? But you're absolutely correct that it might not apply, especially in the modern, with agriculture input to rivers and also groundwater, right? And I actually have a nice plot here that shows, most of the rivers that I sampled for this study, they come from places where the use of fertilizers is huge, right? So maybe even this slight enrichment that you see in the river might not be just a natural process, it might be an anthropogenic process, right? Input of heavy fertilizers into this fresh waters. Fertilizer just coming from seawater would be enriched. So you're absolutely correct. I mean, the anthropogenic sources that might be throwing this assumption off of steady state. And then with respect to groundwater, just being able to measure and see signals is the challenge right now.
Cool. Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Danielle. I've got a question. Silke here. Very interesting talk, nice data, but I wanted to ask you, so you're trying to figure out why the seawater potassium isotope composition is heavy, and you're arguing that it happens because you have preferential uptake of the lighter isotopes in the sediments. Fine, we see the same for other isotope systems, but something that's always baffled me, and the same for uranium isotope system, for example. You're talking here about processes hundreds of meters into the sediment pile. So how does that actually affect the seawater isotope composition, especially because your concentration gradient goes into the sediment, so you have uptake of potassium. So how do you get preferentially the heavier potassium isotopes into the seawater against the concentration gradient?
Yes, great question. So two things here. The deep sea pore fluids are the ones that we targeted because these advection reaction diffusion model is just, more amenable in a system like that. In shallow marine environments where you have bioturbation and a lot of activity, it's really hard to model the systems with this model. But the two parts of this answer is yes, at sites with really thick sediment coverage, that signal from secondary silica formation might not be super effective in changing seawater. But even if you consider the fact that there is diffusion from seawater, that might actually be an important process. So if you have potassium diffusing from seawater into your sediment, and there have been plenty of experiments showing that the 39K diffuses preferentially over the 41K, that would be kind of a kinetic process to explain the seawater enrichment, right? So it's interesting because lithium is supposed to fractionate during diffusion too, but it's way less. Potassium is way more affected by diffusion. So it could be a multi-proxy approach there to kind of try and figure out how much diffusion is actually important. But the other side of this story is that deep sea pore fluid marine sedimentary diagenesis is not really comparable to the kind of diagenesis that you're seeing in shallow marine environments. So the Amazon Delta, right? Papua New Guinea. So those would be the places where orthogenic silicate formation is happening right at the sediment water interface, and definitely affecting seawater chemistry quite a lot.
So would you have a larger flux? Do we know that? Would you expect a larger flux in terms of concentration on continental shelves than in the deep sea?
Yeah, so that is the working hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
And it usually comes from this one study that tracks potassium uptake into secondary silicates in the Amazon Delta. So this is a kind of study that, you know, can be revisited because it's an incubation experiment. It uses muds from the Amazon as substrates for secondary silicates to form. And then you go and you measure the potassium content of that secondary silicate, right? It turns out to be a really potassium-rich clay. But that's not the only clay forming. And some of them, smectites and alike, they have way less potassium in them. So it's it might be a that we are estimating is the word that I'm trying to remember. Potassium flux in these environments, overestimating that flux, right?
Yeah.
But in any case, just with understanding what you need to make secondary silicates, being at the sediment water interface is really helpful for you to get all those ingredients that you need, right? Silica, aluminum, and the like.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
Danielle, I have a follow-up question to Silka's. This is Rob Sherrill. Hi.
Hello, Rob.
Looking forward to talking to you more later. But I'm wondering if you have thought about the potential role of the flow of relatively young seawater through porous, relatively young or not so young oceanic crust that's covered by a significant sediment pile. And, you know, there've been studies showing exchange between deep pore waters and the water flowing much more quickly through the porous basalt, and whether that might be an advective route of taking the products of many tens of meters or hundreds of meters of, you know, deep diagenesis out to an outlet site and speeding up, bypassing the need to diffuse products through the whole sediment pile, and whether that could be an important adjustment to the flux.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting picture that you paint there. No, I haven't thought of that, but I've thought of one step behind it to kind of understand that pore fluid deep into the sediment, maybe exchanging with oceanic crust. How would that affect the oceanic crust itself? Because these pore fluids that I measure here, some of them have delta 41K compositions that are very, very different than seawater, right? Some of them go down to -2 per mil.
Yeah.
Now the concentrations of this -2 per mil pore fluid is like 6 millimolar, which actually is not that little, right? So yeah, that's an interesting idea. So do I understand correctly that what you say is lateral fluid flow in oceanic crust could be picking up chemistry from pore fluid, and then in a discharge site affecting seawater chemistry? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's right. So this is a problem that's been worked on. Jeff Wheat, for example, has worked on this problem with respect to other aspects of seawater chemistry.
Yeah.
And we're working on this a little bit, actually. A postdoc, Lisa Herbert, I'm not sure she's on the call, working with me and working with Yair, has got some samples that, you know, could be interesting from the Southern Pacific rise. And this.
Yeah, no, I didn't think of that, but it would definitely complicate things a little bit, or not complicate, but maybe we would have to then reassess this fluxes quite a lot, because if we are looking at that lateral flux picking up -2 per mil potassium and dumping into the ocean, then now you have to increase the flux out of that light material even
Right.
more, right?
Right.
So this would be yet another flux of light potassium into the ocean that you would have to account for. So yeah, that's really
How
interesting.
much volume do you need of seawater, for example, to make a good measurement?
Not much at all. So I usually do 6 micrograms in my Neptune runs. So I'm using very little
That's
seawater.
a potassium. So what's the I can't do
Potassium.
volume.
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
I usually run really small volumes of seawater diluted by quite a lot. It's
Mhm.
not difficult at all. And I'm
Mhm.
making measurements, very feasible measurements of hydrothermal fluids, even with way less potassium. So it's very doable. Maybe offline, I'll do this quick calculation with you and I can give you precise numbers, but very, very doable.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Just a quick additional question, different topic. There are a lot of
Wait,
people-
there are other question, Rob.
Oh,
And
okay, sorry, I'll
also, we
skip it.
have
I'll leave it
a
for later.
meeting starting in a few minutes, so.
Yeah.
Okay,
Carl
perfect.
has a question there and
Sorry, I probably talked for too long.
No, it was great. So Carl has a question in the chat, and I think we'll have to make that the last question. But again, reach out to me if you would like to.
I have a question
Talk.
if Carl is not. A quick one.
Oh, yeah, the 40K question. I have not looked at 40K because the mass interferences that I get for even 41K are so ridiculous. I don't even know how I would be able to resolve 40K from the Argon 40 that we use for these measurements. But I'm sure that that could be, if the signals are big enough, maybe that could be some other analytical tool to investigate that. But yeah, on short time scales, maybe even to get a sense for this reverse weathering, it would be interesting.
I have a quick question, Oscar. Do we have a minute?
One.
1 minute. So, Danielle,
Yes.
if potassium in the inclusion, fluid inclusion is constant, let's say it's constant, why would I care about the isotope? Why would we care even?
We don't know. So the fluid inclusion potassium seems to be constant because this fluid inclusion studies sometimes assume potassium to be a conservative element in the ocean. So you start by assuming it's constant and then you end up with it being constant. If you so that's tricky. If you do modeling of the different fluxes through time, you can actually see that some people have called for changes in potassium concentration. And then the final thing is Lostein, I think that's how you pronounce his name, himself, who has done this fluid inclusion studies, reached out to me once to say that they're coming out with a new study that shows variability in potassium content of seawater. So if it's fixed, it would still be interesting because how we get potassium fixed using the same processes, they're changing other elements, I think is a pretty interesting question in itself.
Okay. That's
Cool.
good. By the way, they don't assume, they assume that during the evaporation, potassium doesn't go to any mineral. And in fact, they're using it as a surrogate for calcium. So it's interesting because calcium precipitate right away as calcium carbonate. So
Yeah, but there are also potassium rich minerals that
yeah, but
precipitate too.
you have
that's
to be,
after
an
halide.
order of magnitude evaporation. to
Yeah, after
normalize
halide.
all this, yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
All right.
Thank you, Danielle.
Sure.
And we will continue discussions through today. And for those who can't do it today, we can set up remote meetings next week. So reach out to me.